Is Carlos with us as well?
Carlos is here.
Yes, I'm
Morning,
on.
Carlos.
Morning. How we doing?
Good. Thanks for being here.
Of course.
All right, Bob, all yours.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar of the year. My name is Bob Linscheid, and I have the pleasure of serving as the interim CEO for the Silicon Valley organization. And a special thank you to our members, our future members, and partners as we support business in the Silicon Valley. I've enjoyed virtually meeting and getting to know our members, volunteers, and community partners over the last couple of months. And I have to say that we're all unified in our quest to try to figure how we can make business open and be significant again and resilient as we deal with these financial crises at this time. While we've made progress this past week, the reopenings of outdoor dining and personal care services, we continue to be concerned about the pandemic and its impact on small business. Now, our quest is, of course, to hopefully that the sun will come out a little bit more so we can take advantage of support for our restaurants and small businesses. Speaking of support, I want to particularly thank the Black and Hispanic Chambers of Commerce for collaborating with us for today's webinar as we hear from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Small Business Association. A fun fact, our colleague Dennis King over at the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce is also the executive director of the Small Business Development Center, or the SBDC of Silicon Valley. The SBDC's programs are actually SBA programs, and through their affiliation, they don't charge for their services. So Dennis is a very valued resource for small business in the region. They provide counseling, workshops, and small business trainings in English, Spanish, Vietnamese, and Mandarin. So please take advantage of their services. And I'm going to turn it over here shortly to Dennis to give his own little plug. But I want to express publicly how much I appreciate Dennis's support and efforts to help me as I came aboard as your interim CEO. Dennis, would you like to take a few minutes to unmute yourself and say a few words to everyone?
Thank you, Bob. Your message was better than I was going to craft, so thank you. And it's been a real pleasure and honor working with you, Bob. I mean, I see and understand where you come from, and I'm glad to help carry the torch. So for the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, we're the oldest ethnic chamber in Silicon Valley and the oldest Hispanic chamber in the state of California. So we've also had to pivot. I guess that's the word of the day for Silicon Valley small businesses, is to pivot to whatever this new normal is going to be, whenever it's going to be. And in the meantime, do what we can to help people survive. Our Hispanic Chamber has done a lot of focusing, but we've been honored to be the first chamber in California to host a small business development center, which is not just for Hispanics. Our training programs, which we have done quite a bit, including webinars this past year, are in English, Spanish, Vietnamese, Mandarin, and Portuguese. And from time to time, we get other languages as well. We have some 40 different business advisors, almost all of whom own their own businesses. And in addition to that, provide practical real world experience in terms of helping business owners get from where they are to where they want to be. Our particular focus has been access to capital. So in the few years leading up to COVID, we loaned, packaged, or facilitated over $120 million of loans to small businesses. And most of those are small loans. Now, this past year has been very different. We walked some 800 business owners through the process to get their economic injury disaster loans and or their PPP loans. We're standing by and, well, not even standing by, we're running in place to do the same thing with many of the businesses today. So in that spirit, we are really certainly joyful of working with you, Bob, and with SVO again. And we're looking to continue to do what we can to see our small businesses succeed.
Great. Well, thank you, Dennis, again for being here. We were hoping to have Carl Davis Jr., who's our colleague as the executive of the Black Chamber of Commerce, but he couldn't be with us today. He's on a well-deserved vacation, which, of course, we all need particularly.
I'll give him a friendly tease because, Bob, he is an SBDC business advisor as well. And I'll have to tease him and say, you know, COVID doesn't go on vacation,
No, no, it
but
doesn't.
he does deserve it. So
Yeah, I agree. So it's my pleasure now to introduce some of our featured speakers today. First is Jennings Emmel, who's the Executive Director of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Western Regional Office. And he's been with the U.S. Chamber in that location since 2013. And I've had the pleasure of working with Jennings as well. Um, excuse me. Uh, His office is responsible for legislative and political grassroots activities in California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and Hawaii of the U.S. Chamber's national public policy goals. He received his master's degree in international affairs from George Washington University and a bachelor's degree in political science in German from the University of California, Riverside. Prior to that, he worked in congressional and state legislative campaigns in Southern California, and then took his talents to DC, where he worked for the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress and in the Southern California region. So Jennings, thanks for being here today. Carlos Gutierrez is the Deputy Director for U.S. Small Business Administration's San Francisco office. He has a background in business development and program management in the public sector and state government, as well as federal government, academia, and the nonprofit space. Prior to that, he worked for the U.S. Department of Energy, and he has worked also with the Texas Veterans Business Outreach Center, where he led a staff that assisted veteran business owners with the preparation of business plans and mentorship. He also holds a U.S. patent and is a former or founder of several companies. He's written grants and managed just south of $2 million. And he's received his bachelor's degree from the University of Texas, his MBA from the University of Phoenix, and a Master of Science in Technology Commercialization, also from the University of Texas at Austin. Lastly, and what deserves special recognition, is Carlos is a proud Marine. He completed 2 tours overseas, one of which was support of Operation Iraqi Freedom in the Persian Gulf. So thank you, Carlos, for being here. Jennings, would you take it away, please?
Great. Thanks, Bob. Thanks for having me, and thanks for that introduction. And I just want to say it's great to see you again, obviously. And like you mentioned, we worked together personally before in the past. You've been a great leader in the chamber community for many years. You're very involved with the U.S. Chamber in previous positions, particularly on our Chamber of Commerce Committee of 100. So appreciate just your leadership, and the SVO is really fortunate to have you leading right now through these very difficult times, obviously. And just want to also kind of extend thanks to the SVO. As an organization, we've had a very close relationship with you all for many years. We've worked very well, in particular with Monique and with Eddie and the public policy team. And that kind of partnership and collaboration really makes all the difference in the world. When we're talking about getting things done in Washington, D.C., moving the ball forward on important political or business issues. The only way that we're able to do that effectively at the U.S. Chamber is, quite frankly, with the partnership that we have with organizations like the SVO. And so thank you for that. And Monique, I think we can move on to the next slide. And so, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of navigating this package, the COVID package that we saw get passed into law at the end of 2020, which once again kind of is a testament to the work that you all did. I don't think a lot of the things that happened, whether it was the CARES Act in the beginning of 2020 or the kind of couple of reforms, the few changes that we saw take place to the CARES Act, particularly with the Paycheck Protection Program that made it easier for small businesses, more flexible for small businesses. I don't think that happens. And I don't think the last package that we saw back in December of 2020, I don't think those things happen without your engagement, the constant engagement from the business community, and really applying pressure to members of Congress to come together, Republicans and Democrats, get to the table and come to an agreement and get a deal done in support of business. And we were very happy to see that happen at the end of last year, even though it was a few months probably too late. We wanted to see it happen a lot sooner than it did. it was good to see that that happen anyway. And certainly there was a clear case for why that needed to happen, why we needed to see additional assistance. And that's why I have this slide up here with the chart showing the employment numbers in various sectors. These are the sectors that were hit hardest by the pandemic. I don't think that this is much of a surprise to anybody on this call, but certainly you look at motion picture, anybody in the kind of hospitality, travel, accommodation business, food service, restaurants, childcare providers. We've seen employment decreases anywhere between 20 and 40% for some of these sectors, just massive, massive numbers. The unemployment rate in California, actually this number is from November of 2020. According to the most recent data that we have from December of 2020, the unemployment rate is about at 9% in the state of California. It's one of the highest in the country. So the economic circumstances obviously continue to be dire. And really what we've seen over the course of this pandemic is kind of a K-shaped recovery, where we've seen about half of the economy do exceedingly poorly, such as these industry sectors that I highlighted, but the other half is actually doing quite well. Either they're back to pre-pandemic levels or they're doing even better than they were back in February of 2020. And there are a number of industry sectors, quite frankly, that are in the process of hiring. You think of healthcare, for example, where there are more job opportunities and jobs available than there are people to fill them. And that continues to be a problem. And I think that that's going to highlight the need for, well, probably for additional congressional action on the workforce front later in 2021. But all these data sets just simply underscore the fact that we needed additional assistance because half of the economy was clearly being left behind. Next slide, please. So we were able to see additional assistance on December 27th. Officially, that's when it was signed into law. So the Sunday after Christmas, which was great to see. This was a huge bill that was passed, 6,000 pages. Not all of those 6,000 pages were related, of course, to just the COVID-19 pandemic because it was part of a greater spending package. But there was obviously a lot of new stuff here. We did see additional rounds of support for small business, which we're going to talk a little bit later about. And of course, Carlos is going to touch on things like the Paycheck Protection Program and the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. But we saw $284 billion for the PPP. About 130 billion of that was actually repurposed from the original CARES Act. If you all recall, the CARES Act that passed in March, the PPP program was kind of ran through August and then expired then. And then there was essentially a pool of money that businesses couldn't get access to. So that money was repurposed and you had some additional funds as well pumped into that program. $15 billion in grants for live venues. It's a brand new program that was part of this package. $20 billion in grants for the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. Of course, you have unemployment support. You have an additional round of $600 checks. And the unemployment support extends through the middle of March at $300 per week. So that was good to see as well. Next slide, please. And then some of the other kind of miscellaneous items that I just wanted to highlight. $82 billion in funding for the reopening of schools. $20 billion for buying vaccines. Of course, you have more money for vaccine distribution, for testing infrastructure. And then you've got $45 billion for transportation, about $15 billion of that $45 billion set aside for the airlines, for additional airline assistance. If you all recall, the airline assistance program expired in October of 2020, and that's when we saw tens of thousands of airline employees furloughed. So now those folks can be brought back on the job thanks to this new bill and the appropriation of money for that program. So that's great to see as well. Next slide, please. Now, there are a couple of things that aren't in the bill. I think first and foremost, from the U.S. Chamber's perspective, one of the top priorities that we had been pushing for throughout the pandemic and something that we'd heard an awful lot about from business is the need to include a liability protections for businesses as well as for schools, healthcare providers, making sure that there's a legal safe harbor for them so long as they're doing the right thing and complying with the guidance that's available from CDC, from OSHA, that they're not going to be subject to unfair litigation that's related to COVID-19. That was left out of this package. There were numerous attempts to get it in there. It ultimately didn't happen. We are hopeful that as Congress considers new COVID-19 legislation, which I'm sure all of you are reading and hearing a lot about, Whatever materializes, whether it's something close to the $1.9 trillion package that President Biden released, or the $618 billion package that we saw the other day from a group of 10 Republicans in the Senate. Whatever the ultimate package is, we hope that it will include those kind of liability protections for businesses, schools, and healthcare providers. State and local aid is another one that's very likely to be in the next package. We didn't see that in the December package. Democrats obviously looking for a very high number, somewhere around the range of 350 billion. Republicans looking for something significantly less than that. But we are hopeful that we're going to see some common ground on that issue, and that state and local governments that need the aid will be able to get the aid. And then also, of course, liability needs to be addressed in this next bill as well. And we'll see how that kind of plays out over the next couple of weeks and months. But certainly, I think COVID-19 and the pandemic and additional assistance for small business, that's going to continue to dominate the discussion in Washington, D.C. For the next couple of months. And kind of going back to kind of the provisions in the bill that passed in December, as I mentioned, a lot of really important things. The Paycheck Protection Program, reauthorizing that, allowing for first draw and now importantly, second draw PPP loans for businesses. Some other changes were made to that program, I think, that are going to make it easier for businesses to use and to navigate. Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, we saw that re-upped as well. So a lot of really good things. And this is where I'll pass it over to Carlos, since he's the expert, my friend over at the SBA, and he can talk a little bit more in depth about some of those key programs that are going to be critical for small businesses. So Carlos.
Thank you, Jennings. And I wanted to say thank you as well to Monique and Bob. It's a pleasure to join you for this webinar. And we look forward to collaborating with you going forward as well, to go over updates and other details that are being released about these programs, and things that are sure to come related to new legislation that we anticipate coming out in the next over the next year. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about kind of four big buckets here. Debt deferment relief, which was originally part of the CARES Act, but it was extended through the Economic Aid Act. And just for context, if you're looking at updates for these things, the ones that were passed early on in 2020, those are part of the CARES Act, and then the new ones passed December 27th that Jenny just mentioned, those are Economic Aid Act. So if you're looking at things related to specifically to what's coming out now and what's coming out subsequent to all the initial things that came out, that's Economic Aid Act, and that it might get a new name going forward as well. So they might be calling it something else. So just keep that in mind. So the first thing is debt deferment and relief. That was part of the original CARES Act. It was extended on non-COVID disaster loans, and that's really 7A loans and 504 loans, part of the conventional SBA loan packages. And the SBA debt relief program was extended as well. And that had to do with the initial legislation was passed in the CARES Act that allowed for some of those loans to be put in a position where they don't have to have a payment made, and the interest as well is paid by the SBA. And the best source for those is sba.gov to look at alerts and updates. As I mentioned, some of these things may change going forward, so just want to keep an eye on it. So the loan programs, Economic Injury Disaster Loan, and the targeted EIDL loan, that says coming soon, but it actually came out already. But it's all what's meant by targeted there is it's for specific groups. And the first two that it was opened up to have to meet certain criteria, fewer than 300 employees, should be able to show 30% reduction in revenue, and be in a disadvantaged community as it's designated by one of a couple of IRS's methodologies for determining whether you're in a disadvantaged community. I have a couple of dates here and some subsequent slides, but this is important just to highlight. The PPP is currently, as of 1/19/21, open to all lenders. It was kind of tranched at the beginning, open up to specific groups, But now it's open up to everybody, so no need to really spend too much time on that point. The Shuttered Venues Operators Grant, it says here coming soon. This is the slide based on as of 1/9, so it's a little bit old, maybe 10 days. We get updates pretty frequently, but I'm going to mention some information about this one here at the end. And also FAQ recently came out that I'm going to share out with Monique, and there's actually two of them. There's a FAQ on the PPP that was just put on our website, the SBA website. So I'll share that with her, and then you guys can contact her about getting more information on that. Next slide, please. Bear with me a second. I don't know what happened here. We can skip this agenda slide here. Okay, give me 1 second. My notes went off screen. Give me just 1 sec. Okay, so this is just a quick overview what the intention of Congress was for these PPP loans, and it was to increase access to COVID relief funding for those hardest hit communities in this new economic aid package. And as I mentioned, it was initially open to CFIs and specific communities, underserved communities, and leveraging the lender match platform so borrowers can find these and other participating lenders. There were a lot of fintechs added in 2020 that previously weren't participating in SBA programs. So it's good to look at that list and find out which ones are participating now. Lenders remain the best source of contact for the applications and processing forgiveness questions. Just for context, economic injury disaster loans are processed directly by SBA by an office called Office of Disaster Assistance, while these PPP loans are strictly processed by private sector financial institutions. So that's an important distinction to understand. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my slides now. These are just the dates that I mentioned earlier for the tranches and how things were opened up. We're not going to spend too much time on that. As I mentioned, those are processed through private sector lenders. Now, one of the changes is that after the lender review, the lender submits the application to the SBA, where a front-end compliance check is going to occur, and that's to reduce incidents of fraud. And there will be a time lapse between when a lender submits the PPP application information and to SBA and when the SBA provides a loan number back. So for anybody that received a first draw, they might notice, well, it's taking a little longer, and this is the reason. I'm sure folks read about incidences of fraud with the first passage and those first couple of tranches, and this is just a process that was put in place to kind of help to stem that. Next slide, please. So who's eligible, right? So for the first draw, PPP loan eligibility now includes additional types of businesses that I'll cover here in a second. And there's also additional covered eligible expenses. And this is one of the things we got a lot of questions for on those first rounds. The change was also made from an 8-week period to a 24-week period where the loan proceeds can be used. And certain borrowers can now request an increase to the original PPP loan as well. So that's a little bit of that's not the second draw. Technically, it's just an increase. So you would want to contact your lender about that and find out if you are eligible. Now, the eligible expenses obviously included payroll, but now explicitly list out rent, mortgage interest, utilities, other operations expenditures, certain property damage costs and supplier costs, as well as worker protection expenditures. Next slide, please. So these newly eligible types of entities include housing cooperatives, destination marketing organizations, certain 501c6 such as chambers of commerce, and other eligible new organizations. The ones that are still eligible, obviously, your conventional business types, partnerships, corporations, etc. Sole props, 501c3s, nonprofits, and also 501c19s, veterans organizations, and lastly, tribal organizations. Now, the general eligibility is for entities with 500 employees or fewer, but certain entities that meet SBA's alternative size standards or SBA size standards for those particular industries may be eligible as well. And also, Section 501c6 organizations excludes professional sports leagues and organizations with the purpose of promoting or participating in political campaign or other such activities. And there are additional conditions that for 501c6 organizations and these destination marketing organizations that must meet eligible restrictions on lobbying activities and expenditures, things like that. Next slide, please. So what is the second draw? And so this is for borrowers that previously received a PPP loan and have 300 employees or less and suffered 25% reduction in gross receipts. So for most, the max amount of the second draw is 2.5 times the average monthly expense for payroll 2019 or 2020, up to 2 million. Now, specifically NAICS Code 72, the maximum loan amount of the second draw is 3.5 average monthly for those same covered periods. And the second draw PPP loan must submit the information on a different form. They have created a different form here, 2483. So if you're looking that up, that's the one you're going to want to see. By the way, I shared this presentation with Monique as well, so she's able to share that out with you guys. So you'll have all this information in case you're taking notes. You'll have all of this. Also, some borrowers may also use the precise 12-month period prior to the date of application to calculate their average monthly payroll cost. Not all of them, so that's one of the questions that would have to go to the lender. Next slide, please. Here's just some additional eligibility criteria. Has used or will use the first draw PPP loan amount only on eligible expenses. So if you haven't used it, you can't get the second draw yet. And has no more than 300 employees and can demonstrate 25% reduction in gross receipts between comparable quarters. This is a point I want to highlight. That means comparable quarters is if the business was in business already for all of 2019. So you would have to choose Q1 versus Q1 for 2019 and 2020. You can't compare Q1 2019 to Q3 2021. It has to be the same quarter. Next slide, please. Forgiveness is also processed through the lender. None of those things come directly to SBA. This is just something I like to highlight. EIDL advances are no longer deducted from forgiveness and payments. I'll speak on this one just a bit. Early on, there was a requirement for if an EIDL advance, which is forgivable up to 10,000 early on based upon a per employee calculation, they were taking that away from the eligible forgiveness for PPP loans. Now that no longer exists, and that's actually a really great thing because it was a little bit complicated for the lenders and working with the Office of Disaster Assistance. So that's no longer an issue. Forgiven PPP loans are no longer taxable income. That's also a good improvement. And the expenses paid with those loans are now tax deductible, and the IRS is producing regulations on that. Expanded forgivable expenses, we already went over that. And also there's a simplified kind of an easy form parallel to a 1040 easy if your loan was under $150,000, and the lender would be able to talk about that as well. Next slide, please. So these are just some forms that you're going to want to use for the first draw and second draw, 2483, just so you know which ones they are. And there's some instructions on the website on how to calculate revenue reduction and max amounts, things like that. And these are resources here, and I have a more broad, a more expansive resources section here in the last slide. So these are just resources if you're looking on the website and trying to look for more detailed information. Next slide, please. Lastly, as it was mentioned, we have some resource partners that are funded by SBA. Obviously, Small Business Development Center, SCORE, Women's Business Center, and the Veterans Business Outreach Center are great resources. Most of their technical assistance and training is free. I'm not going to say all of it because I know sometimes it brings somebody in, maybe an accounting expert, and there might be a small fee, but I'd say 99% of their resources are free. This is also SBA's customer service line. This is for disaster loans. So the economic injury disaster loan, you would want to use this number here down at the bottom. And here is the site for the PPP loan given at the bottom. You can also contact us directly. I know that on the first slide there, Monique had my contact information, so feel free to contact me directly. But also, if you send an email to this sfomail@sba.gov, that comes to our office, and then it gets assigned to one of our staff members. So either way, just multiple methods. Now, lastly, I will say just a few things about the shuttered venues grant. So this just happened. We had our planning call on Monday, and so this was just released, the FAQ, and I've been going over it. It has some good information, but still a couple of things that aren't really addressed, which I'm sure they'll be coming out with soon. So one of the main ones is the eligible entities. So it's listed here on the types of eligible entities, and it does include some nonprofits. Another big one is whether an organization, a venue with movable seating is eligible. In other words, a temporary kind of theater or setting, and the answer to that is no. Per the Economic Aid Act, specifically requires fixed seating and makes no allowances for temporary, removable, modular, convertible, or other types of seating arrangements. So it's a lot of requirements based on the type of seating arrangements. Now, if it's an outdoor venue and it has fixed seating, it is eligible. So if they meet the applicable eligible requirements. I won't waste everybody's time because, like I said, this came out. I'm going to send this to Monique, and you guys can go through it afterwards. If you have questions, feel free to follow up with me. But it does address a lot of the specific questions that folks have. Another one is a drive-in movie theater without fixed seats eligible? The answer is no. It tells you why, those type of things. And there's a whole list of what disqualifies an entity from participating in that grant, namely when the entity was in business. It would have to be before February 29th, 2020. And there was one other thing I wanted to highlight here. I think I can come back to it. I'm sure there'll be a couple of questions. But for now, we'll go ahead and stop with that, and I'll turn it back over to Jennings while I look for this one other element I wanted to highlight. So thank you all very much.
Sure, thanks, Carlos. Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, yeah, the shuttered venue operating grant. There's more information in that FAQ document. I know that we're still waiting for even additional information, and of course, what the application is going to look like and how that process is all going to play out. But we do have some kind of top line information. As Carlos mentioned, the kind of the businesses that would be eligible, as well as you had to have been fully operational right on February 29th of 2020, had to have demonstrated at least a 25% drop in gross receipts in any quarter of 2020 relative to the same quarter in 2019. Maximum grant amount is either $10 million or 45% of your gross earned revenue in 2019. And it's also important to keep in mind that that you're ineligible if you've received a Paycheck Protection Program loan. So if you can't get both in 2021, but it is important to keep in mind that if you did get a PPP loan in 2020, you could still apply for the shuttered venue operating grant and get that. So that doesn't preclude you from getting the grant in 2021. You just can't get both in 2021. And then, of course, the money could be used for all kinds of things, for whether it's payroll, utilities, mortgage, kind of a number of operating costs, PPE, so protective equipment for employees, things like that. Those are all kind of included as eligible expenses as well for the grant program. And looking at the chat, I think that kind of most of the questions probably are pertaining to this program. So I'm sure when we get to the Q&A, we could talk a little bit more about that program as well. Next slide, please. And the other program that I wanted to touch on, which isn't done through the SBA, but is through the IRS because it's a tax credit, is the Employee Retention Tax Credit. This is something that was around in 2020 from the CARES Act, but quite frankly, it wasn't used very much. I think a lot of businesses looked at the Employee Retention Tax Credit and they looked at the Paycheck Protection Program and they just kind of did the math and calculation, figured that PPP was more advantageous, was the better way to go. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that the retention tax credit was a little bit more difficult to use just because of the eligibility requirements under the CARES Act. So first of all, you could only get, it was capped at 50% of $10,000 in qualified wages per employee. So essentially it was $5,000 per employee. And it was done on an annual basis. So you can only get $5,000 for the year. And in order to be eligible, you had to show a reduction in gross receipts of at least 50% in any quarter of 2020 relative to the same quarter in 2019. So 50% was a pretty high bar, or you could have showed that you were either fully or partially shut down due to government mandates. And then the other eligibility requirement was that you had to have essentially fewer than 100 employees in order to take advantage of the tax credit. If you had more than 100 employees, you could only use the tax credit for employees that you had not doing actual work or not in the workplace, essentially people that you were paying to stay home due to a stay-at-home order or something like that. So it just wasn't all that attractive for a lot of businesses in 2020, certainly not as much as the PPP. So in order to remedy that, Congress decided to boost the program quite a bit in 2021. They increased the credit amount from 50% to 70% of $10,000 in qualified wages, and they did it on a quarterly basis. So you can, essentially what that means is you can get up to $7,000 per employee per quarter for the first 2 quarters of 2021. So you can get a total of $14,000 in tax credit per employee in 2021 if you've experienced a reduction in gross receipts of 20% or more in either of those quarters relative to the same quarter in 2019. The 20% reduction, that, by the way, is a huge change, and that's going to make it a lot more attractive, I think, to businesses because it's no longer a 50% threshold, but it's a 20% threshold. And then the same eligibility requirement pertaining to whether or not you were fully or partially shut down, that still applies as well. And then it opened it up to more businesses. So now it's not just going to be small businesses with fewer than 100 employees that are eligible for this, but small businesses with fewer than 500 employees could take advantage of the Employee Retention Tax Credit. So I think all around, it makes it a little bit more attractive for folks to take advantage of in 2021. And it makes a couple of really significant changes. So it allows for an employer to use the tax credit as well as apply for a Paycheck Protection Program loan. You could do both of those things in 2021, so long as you don't use the money to cover the same payroll costs. It's important. And it also retroactively allows businesses that did receive a Paycheck Protection loan in 2020 to also apply for an Employee Retention Tax Credit to cover costs in 2020 as well. And as you all recall, and as I mentioned, big part of the problem in 2020 was the fact that businesses had to kind of choose between PPP or the employee retention tax credit, and they just chose PPP. But now businesses have the option of applying for the employee retention tax credit retroactively. There are ways that you can do that. However, keep in mind that you cannot use the tax credit and the PPP. If you got the PPP forgiven, for example, in 2020 for payroll costs, you can't use both buckets of money to pay for the same payroll cost. And the way that you would go about applying for this, if this is something that you're interested in, is essentially, since the January 31st deadline has passed, you could do kind of an adjusted employer tax filing to apply, for example, for the fourth quarter. If you want to take advantage of the employee retention tax credit in the fourth quarter, you can do it that way. Or you can file a form 941X and just mark what quarter you would be eligible for the tax credit. Now, it's also important to remember that if you're doing this retroactively into 2020, the rules from the original CARES Act, so the original kind of employee retention tax credit, still apply to 2020. So you would be still capped at $5,000 per employee. You'd still have to show at least a 50% reduction in gross receipts per quarter, or fully or partially shut down. So those rules would still apply if you're trying to retroactively get access to this credit in 2020. But certainly for businesses looking forward in 2021, if you fulfill any of those requirements, fewer than 500 employees, have more than a 20% loss in gross receipts in either of the first 2 quarters of 2021, then you could be eligible to receive up to $7,000 per employee per quarter. And this is just for those first 2 quarters of 2021. What's also great about this is that you can apply to receive the credit quarterly, so you don't have to wait as long to get the money back, which is great. And then this is also something that could be advanced. So there's a form on the IRS's website. I think it's the form 7200. That's what they used last time. I assume that they're going to use probably the same thing this time around. And you can apply for an advance on that credit as well. We are expecting more information on this program shortly. We've kind of only have a kind of basic overview of how it's going to work in 2021. So we're still waiting for additional guidance from the IRS, but just keep this in mind that this is a much more attractive option for folks, and that this is also open to those businesses that received a Paycheck Protection Program loan. Next slide, please. And then kind of lastly, just wanted to highlight our resources at the U.S. Chamber. If you go to uschamber.com/coronavirus or uschamber.com/SB loans, you'll be able to find all of our guides. They're really easy to use. Each of them are just a couple of pages long, kind of break down all the various programs and really kind of easy to understand language. So we've got guides on the PPP loan program, as well as kind of how to navigate the forgiveness of PPP, as well as a guide for independent contractors, for example. We get a lot of questions on how they should go about doing this. The economic injury disaster loans. We have a guide on the employee retention tax credit. You name it, on pretty much all of these programs, we have a really useful guide that's available on our website. So please feel free to check that out. I think that's it. Those are kind of the main issues that I wanted to highlight. And I think we've covered most of the programs available for small businesses. And I guess, Monique, if it's okay with you and Dennis, we could open it up to questions.
Thank you, Jennings. I think there's a number of questions in the chat box, actually, directed to both of you. Shall we go through some of those? Are you able to check?
Yeah. How do you want to read them out to us, or?
Sure. Okay, so let's see. Let me get to the beginning of them and see. Okay, here's one from Chris Smith. Can you tell us about the fixed seating requirements for the SVO? Won't this exclude the majority of small live music venues?
Sure. Carlos, I don't know, do you want to speak on that?
Yeah, sure. And then if you have anything to add, certainly feel free, Jennings. But as I read the recently released FAQs, the short answer to that question is yes, it would exclude. There's a lot of exclusions. A lot of the questions have to do with the fixed seating requirement, and that's the way the legislation was written. Excuse me. I can't really speak to the intent. And like I said, those things were passed, before the new administration took over. So it could change, but as it is right now, the answer to a lot of them related to non-fixed seating and whether they're eligible or not is a no. And it's not even a maybe based on the FAQs that I, as I look at them. And that's where we're at right now. Like I said, I'll shoot them out, and then Monique can share them out with you guys. And if there's any updates, then a couple of weeks from now or the next time around we do this, then we'll definitely share that information out.
Next question from Ben's Motorcycles. Do you know why the PPP2 went off 2019 or 2020 payroll?
The 2019 was used as a baseline since 2020 is when the pandemic started. So in order to show reduction in revenue, you had to have the previous year as a baseline, and then look at it as from a quarter to quarter analysis, or else they wouldn't know if a company had any reduction. There would be no way if they didn't use that as a baseline. And the same thing is kind of being applied now for 21 and 20. So 20 can be used as a baseline as well for the new one. Jennings, did you have anything to add on that?
No, and I think that the flexibility should hopefully be helpful too when determining kind of what your loan amount is going to be and calculating your loan amount. I think for most folks that are going to be applying for a second draw, they're going to want to look at 2019 numbers in order to maximize the overall loan amount and the amount of payroll that they could pay for, because odds are that they had greater payroll in 2019 than they did in 2020. But really, I think this is just kind of more for flexibility purposes. To allow businesses to kind of choose whichever one works best for them.
Next question from Henry Wynn of the Office of Congressman Ro Khanna. Targeted EIDL coming soon. When and how do I get the information?
That program is open currently, so that it's not in a coming soon status. The targeted EIDL is open right now, and information about applying can be found on our website. Like I said as well, that one is managed internally by SBA, by the Office of Disaster Assistance. So certainly questions can come to us, but we don't, at the district office level, we don't have access to the portfolio to look at statuses on loans and things like that. But we do refer individual potential borrowers to the points of contact that we have within that office. So those can and should come to us, and then we'll route them to that Office of Disaster Assistance.
May I also add, speaking for the small business development centers here in Santa Clara County, is that if you have a business here in Santa Clara County and you'd like to walk through that process, we'd be more than happy to do that, and that would be to contact us. In addition to whatever questions that you might have directly to SBA. From Jim Carter, I guess to Carlos, does the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant apply to traditional dance studio, school, whatever? So does the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant apply to traditional dance studios and schools?
I just read something on that one. Let me come back to you, and let me look at my notes here and see. But give me a minute to that one. Let's come back to it.
Okay. Ben's Motorcycles. Why is the PPP based off of payroll when the proceeds can be used for other items?
Well, the short answer to that, and I'll let you jump in there, Jennings. The short answer to that is that's the way the legislation is written. Did you have anything to add there, Jennings?
Yeah, no, the intent of Congress was to keep people on payroll. That was the overarching intent of CARES Act and of the Paycheck Protection Program, was just to keep folks whole and to keep folks attached to their employer and on payroll. So that's why the proceeds that's why kind of the stipulations are what they are, and proceeds should be dedicated predominantly to payroll.
Next, Cheryl Blumenthal, to everyone, can you reiterate what are the safe harbor rules and the salary reduction factor look back period choices in the PPP?
Sir Carlos, did you want to handle this one, or do you want?
Give me a second. Okay. According to the safe harbor rules, I would have to get back to you on that. I don't have the information right in front of me. It's been a little while since I've looked at it, unless you have the answer to that, Jennings. But I do have notes on that I can pull up after the fact.
So there are some safe harbors. So if for example, if an employer attempted, and this really kind of came about as in response to the problems that employers are having getting employees back to work with the additional unemployment, especially when it was $600 per week, and a number of, I think it was even a majority of employees of folks were actually making more on unemployment than they were if they were back in the workplace. So this was a big concern and kind of a growing problem. And so there was a safe harbor for employers that as long as they extended the job offer back to their employees and attempted in good faith to get them back to work and could show evidence that they did that, and the employee turned them down, then they could, that would qualify as one safe harbor. So if they ended up seeing an overall reduction in their employee count as a result, they wouldn't be dinged when applying for forgiveness. Same thing if an employer had to fire an employee for cause, then they also wouldn't see a reduction in forgiveness if their overall kind of FTE count was reduced. So those are a couple of the safe harbors that I'm aware of. I think I could double check, but I think there may be one too as it pertains to kind of government shutdowns as well, where kind of the workplace was shut down and employees couldn't go back to work. But I'd have to double check on that one. But for sure, the first two instances that I mentioned, those are examples of safe harbors.
Good. Next, Steve Borkenhagen asks, do live music venues with no fixed seating qualify for the shuttered venue money?
That sounds similar to the previous one. The short answer is no. Just looking at these FAQs. And I see the next question there that was kind of associated with that one. Does a 501c3 with no employees qualify for a PPP? As Jennings mentioned, the intent of the PPP was to keep people on payroll. So if you don't have any employees, that's a unique situation, because a lender may be able to work with you and you can have some things covered like mortgage and other operating expenses, but they're going to work with you to determine the amount, and the amount ceiling would be probably lower than you would anticipate, because usually it's based upon a 2.5x of payroll. So I really don't even think that with no payroll expense that you're going to be able to get a PPP loan at all, because the calculation that it's based off of is a 2.5x of payroll. So that was the long explanation. Short answer is no to both of those.
Good. Next question. For the calculation of forgiveness for the second loan, is the time period still 24 weeks regarding the use of proceeds for the second PPP?
It's anywhere between 8 to 24 weeks. So it doesn't have to be 24 weeks. Some small businesses want to use that all, let's say, in the 8 weeks, so that they can start processing forgiveness, and they don't want to wait 3 months before they have to start processing that. So if that was their intent and that's why they used the proceeds in that way, then it could be as short as the 8 weeks, and they can still go ahead and start working with their lender to process that.
Next question. Will this work for hair salons?
I'm not really sure what it's referencing there of what will work, but I'm guessing that the question is about whether a hair salon can receive a PPP, and the answer is yes.
Okay. I think that's a good way to interpret that. From Chris Smith, looks similar. If the SVO is only for fixed seating venues, won't this disqualify almost every rock venue in the U.S.? Isn't this the point of the SVO, to help small independent venues?
Well, It certainly would appear so, that based on the way that the legislation was written and the FAQs have interpreted it, that it would disqualify those types of venues. And at this point, that's the guidance that we've been given. Like I said, if you want to keep up to date, then sign up for the alerts at SBA.gov, and we may get additional guidance, going forward, that would include things that are not in there currently.
Next question. I think you already answered this, Carlos. Can you send the record of this webinar to us via email? I think you
Yep.
said at least your portion. Monique?
This is Monique. I will send slides and the recording.
Wonderful. On top of things, as always. Thank you, Monique. Jim Carter, we own a traditional dance studio for kids. We run live recitals at the end of each school year in June. Would we qualify for the SBO grant? Qualifying questions to my previous question.
Yeah, that's the second one on the dance studio, and I went through right now and looked at it again, and I don't see anything specific to a dance studio. So at this point, I wouldn't be able to answer that intelligently. I can't say, and it doesn't address it. So it maybe that's a good thing, because a lot of these other things are overtly addressed, and it says yes or no, and it doesn't mention that at all. So I think it's something that we're just gonna have to wait for additional guidance on.
Yeah.
Carlos, are you saying the dance studio needs to be fast on their feet or watch their step?
I think probably both.
Okay.
And I think too, Carlos, on the FAQ, it does mention when determining kind of eligible entities, would be venues that kind of sell tickets, that promote live events, that have, that kind of have a sound, use sound engineers or kind of lighting equipment. I mean, those are all kind of things that the SBA would be looking for in determining an eligible entity.
Sure.
And so I think that might be something to consider too, right? When you're thinking about a dance studio or whether or not a dance studio would be eligible.
Right. I agree. And there is one other good thing here in terms of the questions and the ones that lack clarification at this point. And that's that SBA is managing this program directly. So any of those questions that can come to us, and then we can escalate them, we might be able to get a more definitive answer for folks than if we had to go through an intermediary. So my contact information is up there. Feel free to, for those two individuals that had the questions about the dance studios, shoot over those questions to me, and I'll escalate them, and we can see if we can get an answer back to you one way or the other.
Next question. Can you get a PPP without having payroll? It will be based on your net profit for the year divided by 12 months times 2.5.
In general, the answer would, well, especially before, it was no, because it was only the specification of the 2.5x, or with that specific NAICS code, a 3.5x. But I noticed on this presentation, and what's changed with the Economic Aid Act, is that they've said that certain businesses can apply based on the full year's worth of assessment of revenue. But I think that point needs clarification, and that's going to have to be another one that's a unique case. I don't think it's very many types of businesses that are going to qualify for that, but we can look into that further. Jennings, did you have anything to add there? Have you heard anything about that?
And it sounds like too, this gets to the point of, sole proprietors and independent contractors, they can apply, and that's kind of how they would apply. They would look at their net profit, or actually revenue, not even profit, but they look at the net revenue over the year, divide by 12 and multiply by 2.5. So just keep that in mind too, if you're a sole proprietor or an independent contractor, that you can also apply for a PPP loan.
Mm-hmm.
Next question. When can we apply for the shuttered venue grant?
I'll let, I don't know about that. I'll let Carlos, I don't know if he's got any insights as to the kind of timing on the SBA's side of things. But I don't know. I haven't seen anything yet, just the FAQ.
I'm in the same position, Jennings. I have not seen the official date of when it's going to open. This is all preliminary information. So as soon as we get it, I'm sure just the same way you saw the FAQs on the website, I'm sure everybody will have the same information about the date that it's going to be opened, and everybody's going to be kind of eagerly anticipating going ahead and getting those applications in.
Next is a comment from H. Wynn, Congressman Ro Khanna's office. Thank you all the speakers. This is very helpful information. It's almost nice to add to the close, but we're not quite there yet. Timothy McNally asks, I believe there were allowances for individual sole proprietors and PPP for them. Is there general guidance on PPP forgiveness documentation, or is it up to the banks?
Everything is a little bit dependent upon the lender, because they're going to have different requirements, maybe different forms, ask you for different types of documentation. So there is baseline guidance, but ultimately a lot of these questions about details and specifics about a certain business's situation and desired outcomes, you know, using these loan programs, is going to have to go to the lender, and the lender coordinates with SBA, and then they'll let you know what the answer is.
Let me jump to a question. Can you clarify the priority rules for the SVO? It states 10% of revenue over last year. Is this gross receipts, or is it also gross earned revenue, like the general eligibility? Example, would donations count on the 10% calculation for priority?
I actually hadn't seen anything on related to 10%, so that's news to me. Jennings, had you seen something about 10%? I hadn't seen anything about 10%.
No, I haven't. No, I haven't seen anything on 10% either.
I don't know what it's referencing. I think that probably requires some more clarification on the question. So we'll have to come back to that one.
Okay. Next, at what point the EIDL was capped at 150K? Was that limit increased with the recent package that was passed?
It was not yet.
Okay. I think, gentlemen, that was the last question.
Great.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, we've come to the end of the time period already. Jennings, thank you very much for your input. Carlos, likewise. You're based here in San Francisco, Carlos, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so, and your territory certainly covers all of Silicon Valley. So we would certainly encourage our listeners to be able to be in touch with either one of them. May I also add from the Small Business Development Center here in Santa Clara County, our number is not posted, but it's 408-248-4800. That's 408-248-4800. Certainly we can help guide you through the EIDL process, the PPP process. There are other loans and grant programs that's available. The California Grant Program, for example, is in its second phase. It's open until the 8th. So if you want some information on that, we can also guide you in that direction. The County of Santa Clara has recently invested $6 million in the California Rebuilding Fund, and the the county's investment is targeted to small businesses here in Santa Clara County. So the good news, bad news is that there's lots of opportunities. They tend to be fleeting. They all have different deadlines. They can be very confusing. So the important point that I think all of us want to say is that we're on your side. We want you to be successful. You don't need to do this alone. You can reach out to any one of the speakers or to us, or certainly to SVO to help you get the resources that you need to be successful. And I think that could bring us to a close for today.
Great, thanks, Dennis. And I saw too, I think there was clarification from Diane on that, on the shutter venue operating grants, kind of, and how they'll be rewarded. So I think we do know that, and Carlos can kind of elaborate further, that I think once the grants get up and running, that the first priority will be for venues that suffered at least a 90% or greater loss in revenue between April 2020 and December of 2020. And that'll be for the first 14 days. And the next 14 days, priority is going to be given to venues that have suffered more than a 70% loss. And then I think after that, it moves to, I don't know if it maybe 50%, but they are going to have it kind of in a tiered way. Once the grant program is up and running, they're going to prioritize essentially businesses that have been impacted the most. And then to her question as to whether or not donations count as gross earned revenue, that is addressed in the FAQ. I have to go through it again, and I can get the details. I can forward those to maybe Monique or Carlos, or I can forward those to Monique, and then she can disseminate them if that works.
Yeah, that sounds good. And thank you, Jennings and Carlos and Dennis, for being here. And thanks for everyone for logging on. I know we're about 6 minutes past time, but thank you guys so much. And I will send out the slides, the FAQ, and the recording, and give me just a bit.
Thank you, Monique, for your continuing support for all of us. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thanks, everybody.